Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening to our participants online and also here with us today. Welcome you all to ICAS panel discussion on China's 20th National Party Congress and also the U.S. midterm election and also its implication for bilateral relations. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China-American Studies, based here in Washington, D.C. as an independent think tank focused on many of the key issues affecting or concerning the China-U.S. relations. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to say a few words about the background of this event. While we hold this event today, I think the time is very important. Less than a month ahead, China will hold its 20th National Party Congress, which will witness the membership lineup, Politburo, and also Standing Committee. And many of us will anticipate what policy and domestic policies and foreign policy along with it. What plans, priorities, and also challenges lie ahead. And then 3 weeks from there, we're going to see the U.S. midterm election under this very complicated international political environment, along with many of the issues here in terms of domestic politics. So we're going to see, then we're going to have a huge or profound implication for the 2024 U.S. presidential election. So we want to see these 2 major domestic political events. We're going to have any impact on the bilateral relations. Are we going to see any, hopefully some development or breakthrough of the very tight relationship currently we're experiencing? So this is the background of this event. It's a great pleasure to invite 4 very distinguished experts to share with us on these issues today. You'll be able to find their full biography on ICAS event website. Let me quickly introduce them. So joining us in ICAS today, we have Mr. Robert DALY. He's director of the Institute for China, Kissinger Institute for China and the United States at Wilson Center. And we have Mr. Rory Murphy. He's the Vice President of Government Affairs at the China-U.S. Business Council. And joining us online, we have Dr. Yawei. He's the Senior Advisor on the China Focus at Carter Center. He's also a Senior Advisor of ICAS Advisory Board. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Denis. He's a Professor of China Business and Technology and also Senior Advisor to the Vice President of China Affairs at Duke University. He's also a Senior Advisor to ICAS Trade Technology Program. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Mr. Sarah Gupta. He is a Senior Fellow with ICAS for many years and has been leading ICAS Trade Technology Program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Nam. Good morning and good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the event, to our event on the 20th Party Congress and the midterms and its implications for U.S.-China relations. Ordinarily, this 20th Party Congress should not have been a big deal because the 19th Party Congress was a big deal. We had a new ideological framework laid out, the new era, a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. We had a new principal contradiction authored, the first one in almost 35 years, which kind of marked a break with the period from the Dengist period onwards. So it should not have been such a big deal, but it is a big deal because of what did not happen at the 19th Party Congress. And what did not happen at the 19th Party Congress was an elevation of a new cohort of leaders who would have taken office at the 20th Party Congress. Yes, President Xi's term limits were extended out, so he is going to have another term. But there are a lot of the other senior policymakers like Liu He, the Premier Li Keqiang, they're either termed out or they're going to be retiring. So the question is, who is this? What does the composition of the top leadership look like, and what are the implications, therefore, for U.S.-China relations going forward? Here in the U.S., we've had quite a policy and political roller coaster year, which has been compounded by President Putin's invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, and the high inflation and the energy prices that we've seen around us. Early summer, it seemed as if President Biden was suffering from political Alzheimer's. He knew where he was in the White House, but he didn't know what he was doing. End of summer, he's become a political Superman. He's passed two mammoth pieces of legislation, the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act with all its green provisions. So he's in a different position, political position himself. And meantime, you know, the Jan 6th investigations are gathering steam. And this midterms is turning out to be an early referendum of the 2024 elections with President Biden and what was almost certainly going to be a America First candidate. So, you know, lots to unpack here, because what is the implications of domestic politics for U.S. China relations going forward? What we are going to do is we're going to have 4 speakers. The first 2 speakers will dwell on the 20th Party Congress and its implications for U.S. China relations. Latter 2 speakers thereafter will talk about the midterm elections and implications for U.S. China relations. So without any further ado, let me pass the floor over to you, Robert, and please take it through.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, good evening to everybody who's listening. It's good to be with all of you. I'm going to give an American view on the 20th Party Congress. So this is an American view. It is not necessarily representative. There are many different views. And I give an American view, recognizing that the American view on the 20th Party Congress is not the most important view. What matters most are views and receptions within China, but we sit here in Washington, D.C., so I think an American perspective is not out of place. I've been watching these Congresses come and go for a long time, since I was a diplomat at the American Embassy in Beijing. And there used to be sort of a guessing game. Every time there was a new party Congress, people would guess and try to prove what good China watchers they were by predicting who was going to be on the standing committee of the Politburo. And people would even predict what order they would walk out in at the end. You had betting pools about this. The American Embassy would pride itself on getting the order right. I think that era is gone, because the era of collective leadership and known process is gone. So there's no point in wondering about which different political factions are represented at which level for now, because this is Xiist China. I think that below the Xi Jinping level, the questions of who's in and who's out, they're not irrelevant, but their relevance won't be known for a long time, if ever. And so the focus, I think, will quite properly be on Xi Jinping himself. I expect him to run the table at the 20th Party Congress and to get what he wants. We're quite sure that will include a new title, whether it's the People's Leader, Renmin Show, or what it is, we don't know. But he will be given some new kind of elevated honorific, which suggests that he's in the Mao Zedong part of the pantheon. In accordance with that, we will also probably see his thought, Xi Jinping thought, or some variation on that. We don't know the precise wording. Enshrined first in the party constitution, and then later in the Constitution of the People's Republic. We'll be watching to see to what degree he bends and breaks age rules about mandatory retirement based on who he likes. But that's obviously a second order issue. It doesn't really tell us very much about the broad direction of China. He will probably bring in some younger proteges and will elevate them, but none of them is likely to be clearly a designated successor. There will always be this guessing game about who succeeds Xi. I think that, we may get some interesting indications of who he likes among the younger cohorts, but there's no sign that Xi Jinping is ready to anoint a successor yet. And the other thing we can be sure about of the 20th Party Congress, not from an American point of view, but from a Chinese point of view, is that it will be a marvelous success. It will be wonderful, and it will be broadly supported by all of the Chinese people, as this is as it's told. But the real question going into the 20th Party Congress isn't so much who's up, who's down. We know that she is up. The question is the old one. What is China becoming? More specifically, how is China going to orient itself toward modernity under a very new and very complicated set of circumstances? One of the things that I agree with Xi Jinping on, there aren't many, but one of them is that we really are facing an international environment with a degree of complexity and urgency that we haven't seen before. I think that's correct. So how is China going to orient itself to modernity, to its domestic and international challenges under Xi Jinping? And I think that there are some signs that it's not going well. One of them is that in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress, the degree of pro-Xi Jinping propaganda, the great wisdom, the omnicompetence, the omnipresence, this is strange for most foreign observers, and I think it's probably strange for a number of Chinese too. It is very hard for some Americans to understand this cult of personality. Of course, Donald Trump has a cult of personality that's also pretty dominant, but there's also pushback within the country against it. It is strange for those of us who've been working with China over the past decades and have seen all of its development to have this proposal that the fate of 1.4 billion people, who we know to be fantastically hardworking and adaptive, the notion that their fate would depend on the wisdom of one man is strange for us. It's an odd proposition. So there's a contradiction, and this is what I see as the central challenge facing Xi coming out of the 20th Party Congress, at least in the international affairs region. There's a growing, glaring contradiction between China's increasing inwardness, the Neijun, and China's concurrent reach for global power. This is fundamentally unresolved, this contradiction between the 特色, between the particularity of China, that in Xi Jinping's telling is so vital to its mode of governance, to its prerogatives. Its 特色 and its particularity is very much in conflict with its assertion that it embodies and can lead something called common values, which is somehow distinct from universal values. And this is a very difficult position for Xi Jinping, because we see now China speaking to the world as it speaks to its own people, usually in the imperative mode. But of course, much of the rest of the world is free to reject this discourse and is rejecting it. So how do you resolve this particularity with claims for leadership? There's a saying in Chinese, 内外有别. There's a difference between the internal and the external. But if you're a global superpower, and China is, 内外无别, there is no really clear distinction between the internal and the external. Everything that you do domestically is necessarily part of your global public relations and your global diplomacy. So how in Xi Jinping's third term does China resolve that contradiction? One of the ways that it is doing it is seeking allies and strengthening its alliances. And we just saw this in Samarkand. It's seeking allies that do not object to China's inwardness or its mode of governance. And it is having some success with this in the global south, especially in countries that have very weak institutions and weak governance. But those kinds of successes, while real, are not going to add up to global leadership. So this is one of the, when I'm listening to Xi Jinping's description of China's situation in the world, that's what I am going to be listening for, questions about the global system. China says that many of the rules and norms that are now in place in what many call a rules-based order. I realize that's a shaky phrase, but China makes the point that a lot of those rules don't reflect Chinese views because China wasn't involved in forming those rules. And that's true in many cases. But it's also true that the rest of the world is not and will not become Chinese. So how does China propose to navigate this? Of course, the biggest issue for Xi Jinping will be domestic challenges, and we know what all of those are. There's no reason to give the long list. Demographics looms as an ever greater challenge. And because the question is primarily about Chinese domestic policies, we'll also be listening in America for any indications of what Xi Jinping really thinks about a reform and openness agenda. You can be sure that those words are going to be used again and again and again. I've got to say, China has been reforming for so long. I think that that word has become more or less meaningless. It's really just code for effective policy, which is what every country wants. I think that the prospects for continued reform and openness are not strong. We have now seen Xi Jinping for 10 years, and we know who this guy is. I don't think he has a sudden double backflip coming out of his back pocket. I think we know how he views governance. We will be watching again for any signs that China is really going to let market forces play a greater role that will open up. Don't hold your breath. The question of openness, which we'll hear a lot about, in my view, it's over. China will never be open again in the old dispensation, in the old sense of openness, a genuine curiosity and active receptivity to foreign ideas, foreign currents of thought, foreign currents of culture. We know that that is being closed down. You know, Deng Xiaoping said that he was letting the foreigners in because they needed foreign capital, managerial expertise, and technology. China is increasingly self-supplying in these areas. The rationale for Deng's openness is gone, and China is in fact becoming less open to foreigners, even before COVID. So I think that the openness in the old sense is probably gone, and that's exacerbated by China's sense that it is under assault from the United States in particular, but also from the global West. China's perception that it is under assault, reasonable from China's own point of view, but it gets in the way of a real reform and openness. So what we're going to see, I think, on display in Beijing is that China is both a confident and an insecure power. This actually isn't that unusual combination. We see it in different styles in different countries. So expect to see that confidence and expect to see that insecurity on display. Expect the United States and other developed democracies to see the outcomes of the 20th Party Congress as evidence that China is becoming an even more inward nation and an even more authoritarian state. I suspect that the language of the 20th Party Congress, like so much American political discourse, will continue to drive the two countries apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your insights, particularly the point about the contradiction between the internal and the external. Dr. Yawei, can I turn the floor over to you now for your viewpoints?
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation by ICAS. Always enjoy to be part of your programming. Unlike Bob Daly's view, so my view is a Chinese view or maybe Chinese American view, because I did spend my first almost 30 years in China, and of course longer years here in the US. So no Chinese see me as a Chinese, but no Americans see me as American either. So it's a mixed view. Secondly, I want to limit my remarks only on the possible impact of the 20th Party Congress on China's foreign policy, not on the domestic side. And you know, I'm a historian, so I would like to offer a historical perspective. So I want to start with the 9th Party Congress, which happened in 1969. You know, I was third grade in the elementary school. We were called up in the middle of the night to go to the streets and basically to parade, to celebrate, you know, the convening of the 9th Party Congress. I just looked at the political report of that Party Congress, you know, April the 1st, 1969, Marshal Linbiao delivered that report. He was also designated the successor to Mao Zedong at that Party Congress. So if you read that report, basically it says the USSR was really bad, it was evil. The US was really bad and evil. But who is the worst, most evil person is Liu Shaoqi. And then it basically said US in sharp decline, and Nixon is out of control. You know, China is leading the revolution in the world, and eventually the United States, the Western world, led by the US, was going to collapse. So I would say, you know, to characterize that report is, you know, it makes Chinese people feel really good. But the real situation in China at the time was dire, was really bad. You know, Marshal Linbiao died 2 years later in Mongolia. And of course, Nixon visited China 3 years later. So what was said in the report, really did not become a guidance of the country. Mao and his immediate advisor knew what was going on, and they had to change strategy. Fast forward to what Saurabh mentioned, the 19th Party Congress. Now I look at the political report of the 19th Party Congress. That's Xi Jinping's first deliverance of a political report. What he said is, on the foreign policy side, major country diplomacy, summit diplomacy, China just hosted APEC and G20, and then, the new concept of community of shared values for the entire humanity, and China is rise in international influence, China's ability to inspire and the power to shape. This is all in Xi's words. So if you characterize this report as China, the report wants to make the Chinese people feel good. And I think in reality, China was also in a very good situation. Back in 2017, Trump was just, elected. He was going to visit China in November. Everything seemed to be fine. There was the Mar-a-Lago meeting. And of course, fast forward to now, we don't know what the political report is going to read like. I think this year, the Chinese people are not going to feel good, regardless of what the leadership is going to say. And the real situation is really bad. So where will the party Congress go? So at this point, of course, we don't know. Our concern is because the situation is bad, so there are two options for China. One is to respond to the bad situation, including isolation, maximum pressure from the U.S. and other countries. China could isolate itself, go back to the first 30 years. So that's one option. The other option, of course, is what Bob mentioned, the rhetoric on deepening and expanding and consolidating reform, focus on the economy. And of course, what we know now, at least for the signs we know, is things have been settled. Being settled because we have a date, right? The meeting is going to take place on October the 16th. And Xi Jinping traveled overseas. If things have not been settled, I don't think he's going to travel. So these things we know that, there is a consensus within the party at the top. Now, what this consensus is remains unknown. So again, we have to do a lot of, as Robert mentioned, a lot of guessing. So my guess is, it looks like, last night I was still very pessimistic. This morning, after I read sort of the speech, by Wang Yi, when he met with Kissinger, and when he met with National Committee, U.S. China Business Council, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in New York, right now I'm feeling a little bit uplifted about where China is going to go. So number one is China is making an effort to distance itself from Moscow. So this was, we can see that by Putin's remarks at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting, that he said we are aware of China's questions and concerns. And second is what Wang Yi said yesterday. So we as I mentioned earlier, China has two options, going back to the first 30 years, or basically to do what we all want China to do. And there are three things I think people on the liberal side want China to do. Number one is to return to collective leadership that Bob mentioned, it's gone. Number two is to fix the economy. And number three, to repair the relationship with the US. I was told this was the consensus. I wasn't sure. I don't know. But Wang Yi's speech yesterday to the group of American business leaders and NGO leaders, I think shows some signs. So of the five things, all five things he focused on certainty. And these five certainties, two of them are general certainties and three of them are certainties on US-China relationship. So of the first two China certainty, number one is China is going to focus on modernization and common prosperity. however you want to interpret it. So it's not going back to class struggle. It's not going back to isolating China from the outside world, because you won't be able to modernize if that's the case. The second certainty is basically what Bob just said, is to expand and further reform. So that's, we can leave that on the side and focus on what are the three certainties on U.S.-China relations. And this is today's theme. So number one, I think Wang Yi said, Bob early on said, Wang Yi is emphatic in his criticism of the U.S. He did criticize the U.S., but he also said, we have to get along. There is no other option other than for the United States and China to peacefully coexist, because he said, we do have different systems, we do have different set of values, but nobody can trample the other country under the feet. So we have to find out a way to deal with each other. So that's the first certainty. The second certainty, I think, has been consistent, and that's Wang Yi's theme, is, our policy toward the US is consistent. And he said, that's trade and economics. That is going to be the main theme of this relationship, regardless of all the other issues. And the third certainty he mentioned is that China is willing to interact with the US on all aspects in all fields. Of course, this is a little different from China's very strong reaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit. They canceled 3 meal-to-meal mechanisms, and then they paused 5 other mechanisms. And now he's, without any specifics, he's saying, we like to interact, we like to coordinate our policies with the US in all other areas. I don't think Wang Yi would say these things, less than a month before the party Congress, on US-China relations, on China's policy toward the US. So this is probably pretty much decided. And that fits into the list, one of the items on that 3 items on the aspirational list, collective leadership, fix the economy, repair the relationship. So China still wants to repair this relationship. Of course, it takes 2 to tango. If President Biden keeps talking about defending Taiwan with American men and women with the boots on the ground, then it's very hard to repair this relationship. And that's what Wang Yi has emphasized yesterday during those meetings. So one veiled threat from Wang Yi, he used a Chinese idiom, is basically there's an old Chinese saying, for 1 inch of our territory, a country will not hesitate, to lose 1,000 people. That's the only veiled threat. And he said the most important thing between US and China relationship, of course, is the Taiwan issue. We need to learn how to manage it. So overall, I think the impact, if we're trying to make a guess, I think the impact of the party Congress on US-China relationship is going to be a very positive one, at least the determination to fix this relationship. Whether this relationship is fixable and how do you fix it, I guess it's up to the leaders, but all of us here can make a difference. We can keep doing what we're doing now, and hopefully we can convince the leaders, in China as well as here, to see how important this relationship is, and how important to make this relationship an anchor for global peace and prosperity. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Yawei, both for your insight about how reality sometimes intrudes on the party reports at the party Congress, and also for your insights with regard to Wang Yi, the conversation with Mr. Wang Yi, and his insights, and generally where China might lean forward in post the party Congress. So thank you once again. Let's turn over next to the midterm elections and its implications for U.S. China relations. And leading off in that regard would be Rory Murphy. Rory, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here in person and virtually. Thank you to ICAS for hosting today's event. When it comes to the U.S. China bilateral relationship, the business community has a lot of priorities, but kind of regardless of the sector, regardless of the company, high on that list is the need for more stability and more predictability in the bilateral relationship. It's been a few unstable years for the U.S. China relationship. That's understatement, but I think we can see some smooth water ahead. 50 days from today, we'll be on the other side of the party congress. We'll be on the other side of our midterms here in the United States. And hopefully our two governments will be preparing for a leaders meeting later in November at G20 or at APEC. I'm hopeful, like many of you, that getting through our respective political processes will, and having our first in-person leaders meeting could bring some more stability, some needed stability. However, as my presentation will show, Congress may have other plans. I'm going to focus on three topics today. One, the current state of the midterms from a purely kind of numbers perspective. Two, I want to spotlight a few races and what that could mean for U.S. trade policy, U.S. China policy. And three, what could the outcome of the midterms mean for U.S. China policy next year in Congress? We go to my first slide. So starting with the state of the midterms and in the House, and let me just make one plug. On our website, the U.S. China Business Council website, we did a report over the summer about how China's being messaged on the campaign trail. I think that's a useful tool for all of you to review. But it's kind of big picture. As you know, Democrats have a very small majority in the House of Representatives. The Senate is tied 50-50, but Democrats have a majority with Vice President Harris's tie-breaking vote. In the House, I think the best way to describe it is that Democrats are more optimistic than they were a few months ago. But the most likely scenario is that the Republicans will take control after November's elections. There's a few reasons for this. One is just, looking back in history, the White House typically loses seats. The party that controls White House typically loses seats in the midterm elections. In 17 of the last 19 midterms, that's been the case, on average around 30 seats. There's also some notable indicators. The chart I have on the left is the probability that website 538 gives the race, 71% chance to Republicans. Keep that number in mind, 71% chance. Also, just looking at individual races, Democrats, the seats that are expected to be competitive in November, a large majority of those are currently being held by Democrats. So just kind of the math of the map looks better for Republicans. So I'd say smart money is on Republicans, but it's not a slam dunk. There's been two examples where the president's party gained seats in midterms over the past 19 midterms. And those follow very notable historic developments. One, in 1998, Democrats gained 5 seats, and this was in the middle of, and I would say, the public's backlash to Republicans for their handling of President Clinton's impeachment and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. The other, in 2002, Republicans gained seats, and this was 14 months after the September 11th attacks. President Bush was quite popular, and he buoyed Republican support in those midterms. I'd say it's too early to tell if the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, if the recent legislative victories we discussed and other developments will have a similar impact on this year's midterms. Some data points in special elections suggest they will. A Democrat won in a state in Alaska, if you can believe it, just a few weeks ago in a special election. But betting markets, polling data, 538, they're all saying that Republicans are favored to take control. We go to my next slide on the Senate. The opposite is true. The odds are essentially flipped here, with 538 giving Democrats a 72% chance of winning, or let's say maintaining control of the upper chamber. Part of the reason for this is that this is flip-flopped from where the House is at, is that unlike in the House, not every Senate seat is up in the midterms. Not every Senate seat is up this year. And the map, generally speaking, the map there on the right, the voters that are voting for a senator, that generally favors Democrats. If I go to the next slide, another important factor, and this is something that Mitch McConnell has highlighted, is when it comes down to the quality of the candidates running, for the Republican side in a lot of these races. A lot of seats that many envisioned were leaning or strongly leaning Republican have become competitive or leaning Democrat. For example, Republican candidate in Georgia, Herschel Walker, was viewed as a favorite against incumbent Senator Warnock, but he's been plagued by scandal after scandal, bad headline after bad headline. In Pennsylvania, Republican candidate Mehmet Oz has slipped in polls in his race against John Fetterman to replace Senator Pat Toomey. He's had a lot of very public gaffes that have circulated on social media. And I think most would argue not a very well-run campaign to this point. I'm going to speak a little bit more on the PA race here in a second, but before I do, let me put a bow on the state of the midterms. 1, Republicans are favored to win the House. 2, Democrats are favored to maintain control of the Senate. But 3, and I think importantly, things are very close, and a meaningful polling error in either direction could result in one party controlling both chambers. So 71% Republicans in the House, 72 Democrats in the Senate. I would just highlight the uncertainty here. I would note that in 2016, 538 gave Hillary Clinton a 71% chance of winning the presidential election. I do want to quickly highlight a few key races. So the Pennsylvania slide is up. And I think that this is an important race to focus on because regardless of the outcome, we're going to lose a voice in this race and others of some unique voices in Congress when it comes to trade policy. Pat Toomey, Pennsylvania, he's the guy there in the middle. He's the leading Republican on the Senate Banking Committee. And he also sits on the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade. In these roles, he's been a very critical of President Trump's 301 tariffs and continues to be today. He's been probably the leading voice against the reverse CFIUS legislation that's been circulating in Congress. His replacement will almost certainly not have the same views on trade policy. As I mentioned, Dr. Oz has spent his campaign very focused on China. In his primary, he made his opponent's business ties to China a key factor. On his website, he very much highlights the need to be tough on China. His opponent, John Fetterman, is strongly pro-labor. He's not really articulated a China policy, but I think it's safe to assume he's not going to have the same proactive trade agenda that Senator Toomey has been pushing for. In Ohio, similarly, Senator Rob Portman, who served as a USTR in the Bush administration, is retiring. Portman and his staff have been consistently reasonable voices on trade over the years. And like the Toomey race, whoever wins in Ohio is going to bring a noticeable change in tone. Both J.D. Vance, the Republican, Democrat Tim Ryan, have been very critical of China on the campaign trail. Both these candidates very much support the Section 301 tariffs that remain in place today. Tim Ryan, the Democrat, continually reiterates, including in campaign ads, that it's us versus China. He was quoted saying that Donald Trump wasn't wrong about everything. He was right on China. J.D. Vance, the Republican, very much is using President Trump's populist playbook, and I think will very much be pushing for his policies to continue. Beyond Portman and Toomey, Congress is losing key voices like Kevin Brady, Stephanie Murphy of Florida. We tragically lost Jackie Walorski a few weeks back to a car accident. And while it may just be a handful of lawmakers in an overall big Congress, the number of positive and reasonable and thoughtful voices on trade and therefore on China are few and far between. Their loss will be noticed in the coming Congress. The last thing I want to touch on is what does the next Congress look like for China policy? For starters, I just want to highlight that regardless of which party wins either chamber, there's no doubt going to be a continued focus on China. The politics around being tough on China are just simply too tempting for lawmakers. The chart there on the left, according to Pew Research, 82% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China today. That's up from 47% at the beginning of the Trump administration. I mean, I worked on Capitol Hill for years. An 80-20 issue is, I mean, it's unheard of. I don't even think that football has an 80-20 support in the country. So politicians are going to be focused on China regardless of who wins. And you can see there on the chart on the right, this is true of both parties. On my next slide and last slide, I want to highlight that this increased focus on China has really translated to action. The number of bills, this chart tracks the number of bills introduced on a given country per Congress. And if you look pre-2017, the number of bills and resolutions related to China was remarkably consistent, 200, 250 per Congress. Last Congress, 639 measures. It's the red line, 639 measures were introduced related to China. This year, we're well over 700. That trend is not going to stop. So I think that there's going to be a focus on China no matter what. I would say that if Republicans take control of the House and the Senate or the Senate, we expect there to be a big focus on China. For example, we know that Republicans are eager to prioritize an export control bill next year that would be largely designed and messaged on China. Depending on what happens this fall on executive action, we know Republicans will very much want to pursue an outbound investment review regime. And I think that is no doubt going to happen. We expect there to be more provocative bills, more amendments that get votes. I think that there's going to be an increased focus on Taiwan. Kevin McCarthy has already said that if he were to become speaker, he would travel to Taiwan. And we've also heard that Republicans, if they take the House, are looking to establish a select committee on China. It's to be determined what the specifics of that committee would be, but we suspect it'd be more theater than substance, but overall not very helpful. Why don't I pause there and happy to move on with the presentation.
Thanks, Rory. That was terrific. And thanks for bringing up that issue on trade. I want to pulse you later in the Q&A on IPEF and all those things, because yeah, trade is on, it's kind of become kind of quicksand in Washington, which it wasn't just 10 or 15 years back. And it seems to me that, at least from President Biden's selfish political perspective, he wouldn't mind losing the House, keeping the Senate, having the Congress gummed up. It might help his re-election chances. So we'll see how that goes. Finally, Denis, allow me to come to you for your views on the midterms and implications for U.S. China.
Thanks very much, and thanks ICAS for inviting me. ICAS has always a knack for having panels on timely subjects in a timely manner. So thank you for having me. I want to start off my remarks by referencing a quote from Professor Aaron Friedberg, who's on the Princeton faculty and has spent considerable time in Washington working on China policy and related issues. And he was recently interviewed in The Wire about U.S. China relations. And he made a remark about U.S. domestic policy that I think is quite pertinent. He said, quote, "There is a danger here of unleashing an irrational animosity, especially given the climate of our politics today. The last thing you want is political parties, Democrats and Republicans, competing with each other to see who can say the harshest things and advocate the most extreme policies," unquote. And I think that this is a comment we need to reflect on much more deeply than in any way we have before. In the current environment, which we all know is highly polarized, there are only a few, very select few number of issues that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on, and one is China policy. And of course, the Biden administration is well aware of this. If we look at the recently passed CHIPS and Science Act, which is designed to keep the United States ahead as a global leader in semiconductor research and innovation, it contains many so-called anti-China components. But remarkably, as anti-China as it is, a large number of Republicans did not vote for the bill because it was not anti-China enough. And I think, again, this is something that we have to take stock of because we're continuing, as Rory said, to see more legislation, more regulation put in place, all designed to constrain our connectivity with China. I would suggest that at some point, curious minds must step back and ask where all of this is headed. And what is the end result we are seeking by invoking all of these efforts at delinking? Frankly, as someone who's been engaged in U.S.-China relations since the late 70s, it seems to me that this is akin to driving off a cliff with our high beam headlights turned on. We somehow don't see the edge of the cliff as we approach it, and as we keep driving, at full speed, somehow we're going to enter a free fall mode, and it's going to be too late to recover from our mistakes. And I think this driving off a cliff analogy is something that we need to keep in mind going forward. There's been a great deal of expectation that once we left the turbulence of the Trump administration in terms of U.S. China relations, that we were going to return to some degree of normalcy in bilateral relations. Maybe not have a torrid love affair with China, as some of us once seemed it to be, but more likely like a rocky marriage with good days and bad days. The so-called old normal in U.S.-China relations, however, seems not likely to be the course the Biden administration intends to pursue. It is hard to tell whether there is rhyme and reason underlying current policy approaches to China, other than to bash China at every point we find an opportunity. I keep asking myself, are we actually already in the new normal, or is there still a new normal coming around the corner? Several months from now, the Biden administration will release its national security strategy. Hopefully, within that document, we will see a more definitive statement about how the president will describe the nature of the so-called challenge from China. Obviously, it's not as if President Biden has been soft on China so far. But if there's a change in leadership in both houses, we could see added pressures on the White House and the State Department to take even harsher measures on China. This may be hard to imagine at a time when the shared sense in both Washington and Beijing seems to be not if a conflict will happen, but when it's going to happen. The Pelosi visit reinforced the mistrust between Washington and Beijing, as we all know. And it was very hard for President Xi to comprehend, after speaking to the so-called most powerful political in the world, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, that Joe Biden could not halt Pelosi's trip. That certainly is not how the Chinese political system works. And I think it got the Chinese a little bit unnerved. As I think about Rory's comments about the midterms and political parties, I would also urge us not to forget another aspect of American politics, and that has to do with interest groups, special constituencies, and unique stakeholders. We have many groups in the United States that have a vested interest in an improved U.S. China relationship. The business community, the academic community, the research community, farmers, airlines, cultural organizations. How does their voice get heard in the political morass and noise we currently see in the US political situation? This is something that also needs to be factored in as we look to the future. I just spent, as many of you know, 5 years heading up a Sino-US joint venture university between Duke, Wuhan University, and the city of Kunshan from 2015 to 2020. Year by year during those 5 years, the challenge of managing an important project like this grew increasingly difficult as the bilateral relationship began to sour. Along with the obvious academic freedom issues that emerged, even issues such as procurement of materials and furniture for our phase 2 construction were influenced by conflicts over trade policy. Research initiatives had to be cleared regarding growing national security concerns. And while it is definitely the case that many US and Chinese universities and scholars would like to re-engage to their pre-COVID and pre-Trump levels of cooperation, there is definitely an ongoing skittishness and apprehension present that make it highly unlikely that many new initiatives can get started or existing initiatives can even be revisited. The education and S&T cooperator relationship had been one of the bedrock elements in the bilateral relationship. Even in rocky political times, cooperation among educators, scientists, engineers, etc., brought a certain level of stability and helped to maintain communication and collaboration. I'm afraid to say that the existing stakeholders in these areas are wondering if there is any path to meaningful cooperation in the future. Granted, Beijing is no angel, and as Mike Lampton has noted in one of his past books, China has been both a rule taker and a rule breaker in a number of very important spheres of activity. And today it seeks to become a rule maker, perhaps to the great chagrin of the United States. Yet one must ask whether the U.S. really wants to discard the connectivity and cooperation with China in science and education at a time when Chinese progress is advancing and improving, particularly in terms of S&T capability and in terms of the quality of its universities. And do we want to give up access to China at a time when we need that access to better understand actually what's going on in China? Let me suggest that we definitely, as everyone has indicated, entered a very dangerous period. And this remains true on both sides of the Pacific, even given what Yawei said about Wang Yi's remarks recently. But not all is lost. This month, the U.S. Public Company Accounting Oversight Board reached an agreement with the China Securities Regulatory Commission and the Ministry of Finance about the requirements for audit of Chinese listed companies, thus avoiding a major conflict. And a few months back, President Biden indicated that he might be willing to relax the tariffs on Chinese products that were initiated during the Trump administration. Nonetheless, more steps are being taken every day to constrain Chinese investment in the U.S. and now even U.S. investment and trade with China. More Chinese organizations are being added to the entity list for export control, and the scope of controlled items in critically regarding industries like semiconductors continues to be expanded. Even given the fact that President Biden and Xi plan to speak face-to-face on the side at the coming G20 meeting in Indonesia in November, I remain extremely concerned that given the heightened tensions, an unfortunate miscalculation or misperception could lead to some horrendous consequences. Will it be a conflict tied to Taiwan, which continues to be smoldering more and more each day, or a conflict over sea lanes in the South China Sea, or even a diplomatic incident akin to what happened to our Canadian friends regarding Yawei and Madam Meng? This is not clear. I simply suggest that politically, we take a significant pause before we drive off that cliff that I referred to earlier, and before we allow the momentum of growing political mistrust and poor communication to take control over events. Even including the events of June 4th, 1989, frankly, I've never been so worried about the state of the bilateral relationship. And I don't believe there's even a crack of daylight coming from inside the US political system, midterm and beyond, to remedy the situation in the short to medium term, whoever is in control of the House or Senate. The US must move beyond largely defining our domestic and foreign policy stances in terms of only containing or constraining China's rise. But whether such a new perspective can come out of the Congress or White House remains to be seen right now. And the Congress clearly needs to do a better job of listening to those various stakeholder communities and constituencies I mentioned before, because there are people who still remain interested in engagement with China. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis, for your insights. I'm going to come back to you for the very first question, but before I get into the discussion and Q&A phase, I want to tell our audience, please fire out your questions and we will take some of them and we will ask the panelists. Let me directly kick off this segment. Denis, the question to you is, given your expertise in science and technology cooperation, yes, you laid out it is in fact, very pessimistic. Are there any suggestions that you can have which could be directed to both sides? You know, in many of these bills, like the Chips and Science Act, et cetera, it's specifically written in a way to ensure that Chinese researchers basically get elbowed out from participating in any basic or any sort of research with their American counterparts. What is your recommendation to both sides, including to the Chinese side? Maybe should the talent program, et cetera, be scrapped? Or what would you suggest are some very broad pathways if we have to reconceptualize how S&T cooperation can restart?
It's a great question, and I'm involved in a number of activities that are probing where these so-called new areas of opportunity might lie. One of the unfortunate consequences of the Chinese response to the Pelosi visit, as you know, was the curtailment of the efforts at cooperation on climate change. And that's, as I said, very disappointing. But I tend to believe that we are at a very critical point, because we still continue to rely on agreements and accords that were signed in 1979, 1980, early 1980s, that define the terms and conditions of bilateral cooperation. And at those times, the relationship was very asymmetrical and very hierarchical. There was no parity, and therefore the flows were one way, and the relationship was defined in certain terms. I would argue that in 2022, everything has changed. And we need a 2.0 version to chart what I would call a new roadmap. And the two countries need to sit down and configure a series of new agreements and new protocols that will reflect the current situation going forward, so that for the next 40 years, we can have terms and conditions that will allow cooperation to take place and each side feel protected in terms of their core interests. I think that we've entered a period of sort of no man's land. The past documents are not very useful, and we don't have any new documents to define the future. And until we do that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. This last comment, one last area where I think we do have some hope, and that's in healthcare. I think that if we can put the pandemic on the back burner, the COVID pandemic for now on the back burner, about where it started, who caused it, and all that, and return to that at a later point in time, there are a critical number of areas where we could begin to collaborate. And one of those areas that I've started to look at is there's a huge project on the brain going on in both countries, the United States and China. Some of it geared to dealing with the onset of Alzheimer's and early dementia in adults. And fairly soon, China will have the largest population in the world of persons suffering from Alzheimer's. So both countries have a critical interest in looking at brain and brain function, and to see how we can have early diagnosis and early intervention to prevent this horrible disease. I would suggest that that's an area where we could begin to strike up a new kind of collaboration going forward.
Thanks, Denis. I had one question for Yawei and for Robert. But now, if you have questions, we can start taking some of those questions afterwards, after this question. The question to you, Robert, and to you, Yawei, is looking at the Chinese side, looking at Xi Jinping, are we going to see in the third term a doubling down of what he has essentially been doing in his first two terms? Or do you think, as you talked of, with Wang Yi saying those things, that there is an understanding that there must be a slight pivot away? So the question essentially is, it's a two-part question. The question is he going to double down or kind of pull back a little bit? And the second question is, what is one significant thing that can be done at the Chinese and by the Chinese themselves, which can help leaven tensions with the United States over the next couple of years?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't want to act as if my prediction is certain in any sense. The story of modern China is a story of change, very, very rapid change, and that remains true. So I'm not giving you a certain prediction, but I think that doubling down is more likely. Xi Jinping is extremely consistent. High marks for consistency, any way you want to go, and he is very proud of what China's zero COVID approach has achieved for China in terms of low death rates. Obviously, we know that that's a little shaky now, but overall, he has added China's handling of COVID to China's handling of its economy as one of the major legitimizing factors for the government, and as evidence of the wisdom of Chinese governance, which is proof that China should have a greater leading role internationally. So COVID is important. Well, what are the lessons of COVID for Xi Jinping? Isolation, surveillance, and authoritarianism work. And he was deeply committed to all of those beforehand. So I think that he is likely to double down there. And while we will certainly see in the 20th Party Congress a lot of sort of a desire, a will toward reform, because China is very aware of its many domestic economic issues. One of the other things that Xi Jinping has been very consistent about is control. It's all about control. So there's still a will, or there's lip service to reform. But in all of these cases, when you get down to specific instances where compromise and risk may be necessary, he has tended to err on the side of greater control. And so that is my expectation, is that that will continue.
Yawei?
Well, to be short, I think all Chinese leaders are concerned of mandate of heaven. And the Chinese Communist Party's mandate of heaven is basically, in the past 4 decades, to improve the living conditions of the Chinese people. So if he is going to double down, I think that means isolating China further away from the developed countries. That means the economy will continue to get into a tailspin. That means the living conditions of the Chinese people are going to go down. I believe there are enough Chinese people who have benefited from reform and opening up in the past 40 years that to permit doubling down, even though initially they may not be able to stop it. But eventually, I think doubling down, if that's what Robert has indicated, is suicidal. So I'm hopeful that this is going to change. And after the Party Congress, they're going to focus, as I mentioned earlier, to improve the economy. To improve the economy means you need to widen your contact with developed countries. You need to have access to the marketplace outside China. You need to get Americans to be less cruel and brutal on China. And for all of that, China needs to do things. In terms of what Xi Jinping or the Chinese top leadership can do, sort of to make the space slightly bigger. I'm not sure. I guess it depends on what is U.S. top priority. The Chinese leadership is looking at Taiwan. I don't think they can compromise on Taiwan, but they do need to learn how to deal with the U.S. deliberate, intentional crossing of the red line, that not to react every time, a speaker's visit, after Pelosi, maybe McCarthy will visit, the Taiwan Policy Act, one after another, they're all going to be there. You just have to learn how to respond to them and not to be radical, because each time you cry, the wolf is coming, your credibility is challenged. And so I think China should learn a lesson in the past few years, not to react too strongly to what's going on in Congress. I mean, they can look at Congress, they basically, particularly the China Policy Act, by Menendez and Lindsey Graham, see it as rent-seeking to get Taiwan to buy Boeing 787. If you look at from that perspective, no big deal. Why do you want to withdraw your ambassador if this goes through the Senate? We don't even know how House is going to respond to that. So, I would urge the China side to come down and not to overreact, and then after that find ways to expand that communication with the American counterpart. Hopefully, at the November summit, the two leaders can find a new framework, or at least, the umbrellic framework, for their advisors to improve.
Yeah, Denis, you had a two-finger. Please go ahead.
Just a quick two quick comments. One is that Robert said, if you look at the history of modern China, it's one of change, but it's also another element, and that is xenophobia. And what is happening right now is we're feeding into the deepest part of xenophobia that is part of China. And, it is not strange to see the Chinese react in the way that they have, because it's highly consistent with the suspicions they have about the West, that I think we've always been surprised where China has not reacted like this. And then when it does act like this, we now seem to be so surprised. But I'm a little bit, I don't understand why it is that we seem to be so surprised by all of this. As Yawei said, we keep pushing. We're pushing China in a direction where for the last 40 years, we seem to have said, no, that's not where we want China to be. We want China to be integrated into the mainstream of international affairs, whether it be S&T activity or political military affairs. You can go back and read Nixon and Kissinger, as Robert knows, about the underpinnings of their thinking about China. And I don't seem to understand again where this is all headed, because we're pushing. And as Yawei said, we can ask the Chinese, don't react so sharply and don't react so. But the reality is, all they keep seeing is lots of stuff being thrown at them from all different directions. And I am not surprised, and I think that we are going to be, a little bit shaken when we see the end result of what we have actually created. And again, I'm not saying that the Chinese side are angels and that they're victims or whatever, but I just see that we have a full court press right now, and I don't see any evidence that there's, as I said, no light at the end of the tunnel, that we're going to have an opening somewhere soon.
Thanks, Denis. We still have 10 minutes left. Now, would you like to throw out a question? I have a question for Rory. I'll come to that afterwards, but why don't you?
Given that we have about 12 minutes left, and there are a lot of questions lining up on our audience. I think we should give them a chance. Let me try to group them so that we can make it happen to cover most as possible. So the first question is related to Nancy Pelosi's visits to Taiwan. It's a very important cover in your talk. So very straightforward question. What kind of role do you expect U.S. lawmaker to play after midterm election regarding the situation in Taiwan? Would the result of midterm election matter? I think, Roy, given that you have been looking through the prospect relation, maybe you want to take this. Yeah.
Sure. I think the short answer is, one, Congress is going to continue to try to play a role in Taiwan. It's been very clear, the Taiwan Policy Act, and we're going to see bills like that in the future. But I don't think the outcome of the midterm really changes the dynamics. We had Speaker Pelosi go in August. Kevin McCarthy has said he would like to go. I think there's been 5 congressional delegations that have gone to Taiwan since Speaker Pelosi went just 6-7 weeks ago. 2 governors have gone over. I suspect from a political perspective, there will be incentive to continue to legislate on this from Congress and to travel over.
Anyone else jump in on this? I assume there's a consensus on this, that is how it's going to be. Yeah. But no.
Okay, then we move on to another very equivalent question from the Chinese side. So we are assuming that young judges will be retiring. There were some exceptions there and on Chinese foreign policy decision making. So with Wang Yi, it's going to be a replacement, and whether we're going to see any change in terms of China's foreign policy, or we're going to see a continuation of Xi's centralization of foreign policy.
It's a great question. Robert, do you want to go?
If Wang Yi indeed takes Yang Jiechi's position, which seems likely, I think that for the reasons that we've described and that Yawei has gone over, we may see a change in style, but I don't know that we'll see a change in substance. I'm not sure that China is willing to change any of its goals in its foreign affairs. It has room to be less wolf warrior-like. It has room to signal stylistically, but in the individual issue areas, I'm not sure that China is ready to make significant changes. And I don't think the United States is particularly looking to change its goals and assessments either. So maybe China will take a run at a change in style and rhetoric, but I don't see a change in behavior or goals.
Yawei, can I ask you also to jump into that question? And can I add one more question, tack something a little bit additional on? in terms of foreign policy decision-making, consider if President Xi is in the middle and you have the foreign policy bureaucracy, a senior foreign policy bureaucracy, and the PLA out here. Where does President Xi lean in terms of foreign policy decision-making? How much of a factor is the foreign ministry and the foreign policy higher bureaucracy part of actually decision-making on foreign policy in your view?
I agree with what Bob said. If Prime Minister Wang Yi succeeds Yang Jiechi as the top diplomat in China, there will be a style change. You know, Foreign Minister Wang Yi is more energetic. He's more diplomatic. He's more articulate. But you know, to combine this question and your second question, I think all foreign policy decisions are now centralized at the top. You know, there are special interest groups in China. The PLA certainly plays a vital role. You know, the oil industry, you know, the SOEs, they play a very important role. Foreign ministry, you know, it's the largest ministry in China. It has diplomats all over the world. But I think the past decade, we see the trend that everything is centralized, and dare to struggle, you know, seems to have become the motto of China's foreign affairs. You know, so it doesn't matter who is going to be the top diplomat. China's foreign policy thrusts are not going to change unless there's a change at the top. So that's where I'm going to put my finger on. If there is no change, if the mentality continues to be dare to struggle and good at confronting China's enemies, then China will continue to be isolated by the developed countries.
Yeah, let me try through another different category of question. President Xi proposed 2 initiatives in the past year in terms of international community. So the first is the Global Development Initiative. The second is Global Security Initiative. So from the American point of view, how the U.S. view this new initiative compared to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Denis, do you want to take a shot at this first?
Sure. I mean, I think that what Xi Jinping is trying to do, of course, is to assume center stage in a way where directly competing with the United States for the key pivotal position, and where I'm sure that they assess that the United States is not going to be able to take the same kind of high ground in terms of resource commitment, et cetera, et cetera. I'm you know, again, the U.S. has taken the position that it doesn't really want China to define the rules of the road going forward in terms of international affairs, and that there are a number of Chinese positions on various issues that are not appealing to the United States in many ways. But I guess, you know, my sense here is that if we're going to find a way out of this current situation without conflict, we're going to have to find a way how to bring China and the things that it wants to see happen internationally to the table, and give the Chinese a voice where we heretofore have been reluctant to do so. And I think that that's what the Chinese are sort of scurrying for. I wrote a paper about a year ago in which I talked about how China is placing more diplomats in international science and technology agencies in order to shape the agendas of these agencies so that Chinese perspectives can be more accommodated. I think that this is typical of what China is doing now. I don't want to use the word aggressive. I would just say being more assertive in getting its voice heard. I know on the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping made a commitment to improve China's performance in terms of debt diplomacy and negative environmental impacts and things. And I think China knows that it has to clean up its act if it's going to be able to command the high ground here. So I think that this is going to be very interesting to watch. And I'm not sure the U.S. does indeed have a ready response, or if the response is something like the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, Forum. I'm not so sure that that's going to be the best response, particularly if it doesn't include China's participation.
Well, Robert, on
Well,
DHEs?
I agree with Denis's views. I think Washington's view on these new initiatives is one, they're fantastically vague. They're almost without any real content at all, and they don't, in fact, propose any new rules. They're purely aspirational, but it's clearly an aspiration for a bigger role in setting global norms and practices. And that gets us to what I think is missing, which is the overall framework here. It is my view that the United States and China are already essentially on a Cold War footing. Not the Cold War, but a Cold War. And despite what Wang Yi said in New York about economics and trade still being the ballast, in fact, in Washington and Beijing, security is in command. Security issues are going to be dominant. And there's been a fundamental sea change in both countries. For the United States, in terms of all the kinds of cooperation with China that we had during engagement, which I was very much a part of and would like to see continue in many ways, those were founded on the idea that coevolution was in our mutual interest, and Americans participated in China's development to make money, to help China integrate, but also as a matter of human welfare. But now there's a view in the United States, which I think is not unreasonable, that continued increases in Chinese welfare and wealth also serve advanced Chinese power, which is not in America's interest. And that's the real sea change that prevents this kind of cooperation. And China, while it isn't as frank about its security concerns, actually feels the same way. And I think that's the broad framework here. There's no going back.
Great. Can I get my questions into Rory? I had a specific set of questions. Thanks for bringing up the issue of the retirements of the Republican senators, especially, Democrats have talked trade, but were never instrumental in passing free trade agreements. They never put up the votes. It was the Republicans who did so. And now the Republicans are themselves kind of shot through with America First, mercantilism, protectionism. Specific questions I had at this is, say the Republicans win one of the houses, one of the chambers. Where do you think in terms that IPEF is going? And what is Republicans' reception to IPEF going to be? Second, you talked about export controls. There's already a lot done on export controls. What specifically are they aiming at in terms of export controls, the Republicans taking it to the next level? And a final question, sorry, I know I'm loading too much out here, is I am assuming the Chinese would prefer Mr. Biden rather than a Republican president in 2024. Do you see a sort of, again, getting into a process of negotiations with regard to market purchases and those sort of things, agreement coming through over the next 2 years?
Sure. So I know we got a couple minutes left, so let me just go through those quickly. I think that the landscape here in Washington, candidate Biden promised that his focus, if he were to be elected, would be to invest in the United States first. With the massive infrastructure bill, with the IRA, with the CHIPS Plus bill, I think he and his team believe they've satisfied that promise. So looking into the next 2 years, maybe there can be a more proactive trade agenda. Maybe there, something like TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, not the Taiwan Policy Act, TPA, the traditional TPA, could be brought up if Republicans take control of one house. That's possible, but I think looking at the next 2 years, something like IPEF is probably as good as we're going to be able to do in the Asia Pacific region. I think there's going to be frustration from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle that there's no market access components to it, but we also shouldn't minimize IPEF, and it could be a lot done with like digital trade and other areas. On export controls, you're exactly right that there is a lot out there. And I think there's not a great understanding about what is currently covered, and importantly, what's not covered by your export control laws, sanctions laws. But we would encourage lawmakers and the administration to really investigate those gaps. Instead of putting a new regime over the top of everything, let's spend time figuring out where the gaps are and putting new rules in to address those gaps. And lastly, on your point on preferring Biden to President Trump or a similar America First candidate, I don't know what Beijing's preferences are. I mean, I think there's some preference towards the more like a normal landscape that we've had. But there's plenty of folks in Congress, outside of Congress, that are running for president in 2024. They're making China a central part of their campaign. And we're going to see a lot of, I think it was Denis mentioned this earlier, but almost an arms race of policies on China. That's going to continue over the next few years.
Now, one last set of questions.
Thank you. I think I really want to take this question. I believe among attendees, there is some couple of academic communities, including students, professors. The question is to all the panelists, when do you think the U.S. government will resume the Fulbright program? Consider it's a fresh from people to people exchange. And then I was like recalling earlier Rory's observation right now is saying 82% of American views are unfavorable of China. I believe in China, we probably, if we done similar survey, we probably will get the same answer. So the question related to this one is whether we can still see any opportunity that China and United States can actually work together and to go through this current situation, people to people exchange, or for instance, climate change, given that the dialogue has been suspended. So I think the question is to all the panelists, last chance to give your comment on this.
Denis, once again, let's try first with you.
So let me see if I understand. The question is, are there any areas where the two countries can actually work together?
And also in terms of educational exchange, particularly, the Fulbright program, which Nong was talking about, if that, can that get to the next level?
Well, right now, I mean, I don't know any U.S. university, for example, that is going to engage in, forging another joint venture. I don't know if the Chinese side would allow it, and I don't know if the constituencies on the U.S. side for these universities would support it. And so that's first of all, that's one big thing. The Ministry of Education in China right now, I think, is heavily divided. There are the political forces that are adhering to Xi Jinping, more control, political controls and ideology. And then there's still the part of the MOE that is very oriented towards internationalization, want to see Chinese students continue to go abroad. So I think that even in China, this is hard to consummate. I've been trying over the last half a year to a year to create a new consortium of U.S. and Chinese universities to talk about, in fact, how they can work their way out of the current problems and get to a new kind of clearer space. It's sort of like an airplane when it flies into turbulence. The pilot gets permission to go another 10,000 feet in the air to get clearer air. I think we've been trying to look at where that clearer air might be. Right now, we don't see any support from the political authorities. And I will just tell you this, I talk to organizations like AAU and ACE and APLU, etc. There also is a nervousness about getting too far ahead of where the U.S. government is, and they don't want to be seen as running amok in terms of where U.S. policy is directed. And so for the United States, at least, that is a big constraint on what's possible. So I'm hoping that there are a few under the radar kinds of projects that we can engage in, university to university, think tank to think tank, that won't run into that radar and make the newspaper or whatever, and those can keep going forward to the mutual benefit of both countries.
Yawei, do you have a quick view on this one?
I want to focus only on the China side, regardless of what's happening over here. For China, of course, you need to give universities, academic institutions, think tanks more freedom. To get, a researcher, a professor, even to speak at a webinar like this, they have to have authorization from the top. That's insane. Number two, you have to change your COVID policy. If students at Duke Kunshan cannot go back, if students at Yale, Shanghai cannot go back, if students at Schwarzman scholars cannot go back to China because of COVID restrictions, just stop talking about deepening and expanding people-to-people exchanges. You really don't want it. If you really want it, you need to be flexible. You need to change the policy.
Sure. Thanks, Yawei. We've run over time. We are going to have to wrap up out here. As the moderator, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question to all the panelists. Please give me a very short answer, yes no, or maybe? And the question is this third term, is this third term the final term of President Xi Jinping or no?
No, it isn't.
Rory?
Maybe.
Yawei
No.
and Denis?
No.
Okay, there we have it. Thank you for your answers. And thanks to all the panelists and for all the effort that has gone into organizing this, and to the audience, especially in China, staying up this late. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. I absolutely did, and look forward to having you all again at our next TNT event. Thanks to all the panelists once again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
再见。
再见。